Buddhism starts with truths, generally. Trying to just, observable truths. And one that's pretty observable these days is these are anxious times. Um, People often like to talk about, how much worse it is now than it was before, and maybe that's true. Certainly, we do diagnose more anxiety and mood disorders than ever before, and we prescribe more drugs for them than ever before. I'm old enough, however, to recall the threat of the Cold War, and there was, for me, an anxiety that I kind of carried all of the time. I didn't even know I did until the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed, and all of a sudden that anxiety went away. And there was an openness that I didn't even know I was missing. I hadn't recognized this kind of constant anxiety until it left. And in 1997, my oldest daughter was born, and I was so pleased that she was not going to have to grow up with that sense of, of anxiety all the time. And then September 11th happened, and it was back again. And now coronavirus is giving us new ways to be anxious. And it's shown us the truth of interconnection among all people and all systems worldwide. It seems to be showing us the failing that comes from believing in the capitalist idea that we're only okay as long as we're buying things, because we're actually okay. So to paraphrase Robert Curzon, the problem with anxiety is not that we're anxious. The problem is we're not anxious enough, or at least not about the right things. And we further miss the mark by not working with our anxiety properly. We tend to think that anxiety is something we're supposed to get rid of or get away from. And so we do a whole bunch of things to try to run away from it, or distract ourselves with our phones, or medicate, or self-medicate. These at best are treating the symptoms. So they don't really help very much. And then we believe, because what we've tried to work with hasn't helped us, we now start believing that our anxiety is a big problem. And it's so big that we can't even work with it. And then many people will double down on the bad strategies we've been using that we already know don't work that well. So today I'd like to offer two different views of anxiety. And perhaps before I do, it's maybe useful to think about why we should. Our views guide what we pay attention to. They flavor our experience. They perfume our experience. For example, I have a colleague at work, and I have a view about her that she is a pain in the butt. So when I have to be in a meeting with her, if that's my view on her, if she says something ambiguous, what do you think happens? Do I give her the benefit of the doubt? No, I tend to think she's a pain. And so I interpret it as annoying. Anything that she says that's annoying, I take that as further proof that I'm right. She's annoying. And anything that she says that's useful or kind, I probably ignore because that doesn't fit my view of her. So view is important because it shapes what we even pay attention to. And that, of course, is our reality or becomes our reality. If you're, want to keep track on your lucky Buddhist scorecard, view is the first step on the Eightfold Path. And it's the first one for a good reason. Our view can change everything that happens after it. It can change our intention. It can change our actions. So it's important to come back to thinking about what our views are and examine them and reassess them. It's probably worth doing regularly. So one view on emotions that I find valuable that comes from the Buddhist tradition, primarily from the Vajrayana traditions, is that all emotions have co-emerging properties of both wisdom and confusion. For example, the wisdom of anger is clear seeing. In that moment that anger arises, you are clearly seeing that something's wrong. There's an injustice happening, or there's something that seems unfair to you. The problem is that at the very same moment, that emotion brings with it confusion. Now, the confusion can be of many different types. It's often that we feel we should do something, when many times it would be better to wait. We often tell ourselves a story about what's going on, and the story is never the whole truth. And so the story further confuses us. And so once we've told ourselves the story, and then, of course, we believe our own story, we would again get to a point where we feel like we should do something. And if this action comes from the story we're telling ourselves, it's probably not the wisest action. I think the most typical way we experience our confusion, at least around negative emotions, is that we want to do something to reduce our feeling of the emotion. We want to get away from the emotion. And this is almost never going to lead to beneficial outcomes. So one of the benefits of meditation is that it helps us slow down our reactivity, so we can start seeing our minds a little more clearly, and then we can start getting a little better at separating the wisdom from the confusion. This might be a bit of an oversimplification, but it might be useful. I think if we think about different afflictive emotions, fear, the wisdom of fear is often that there might be danger. So we need to be paying close attention. Jealousy. The wisdom of jealousy is we're in danger of losing something we care about. Sadness. We need to slow down and take care of ourselves, is the wisdom of sadness a lot of the time. Anxiety is the wisdom is there's something to be careful about. So when an emotion is arising, it is telling us something true. It is our wisdom arising, trying to communicate with us and with others. We often, however, blur the picture with our judgments about it, our story about what's happening. The story isn't true. The story is at best partly true, and often it's not even that. It's just a story. So the story usually comes from the confusion side, not the wisdom side. Now, I find this approach beneficial. It means that the goal isn't to suppress our emotions, not a bit. But it's also, we can't just dismiss them. And it's also, we shouldn't be a slave to them. We shouldn't be acting out because of them. Neither should we be trying to control them or manage them. Our goal is to listen to them. Our emotions have wisdom to share with us. And when you want to listen carefully, we have to get quiet and keep still. And as we do, as we become quiet and pay attention to our emotions, it might become clear that there is something you need to do. Or in which case you can basically relax because now you know what to do, go do it. It might become clear that you shouldn't do anything at this moment, in which case, again, you can kind of relax. Or it might not become clear, in which case you should probably relax again and really pause and listen some more and pay more attention before leaping in. Because when we react without clarity, we often make the situation worse. And as we practice this, both on and off the cushion, we stop being so reactive and we start being responsive. We can stop feeling like we're being so buffeted by our emotions, no longer a slave to them, but friends with them is the Buddhist way of thinking about it. And this includes our bad emotions, because we know that they're trying to tell us something we should be paying attention to help us decide whether we should cross over the divide or stop at the edge before we fall in. We stop feeling like such victims of our emotions. And before I go on, let me pause and ask you, does this feel useful to you? Do you sometimes feel, like you're being victimized by your own emotion, that you're you know it's yours, and yet it seems like it's attacking you in some way? Does that ring true for any of you? You're welcome to grab the mic or chat in the text box.
Absolutely. Um, I think I'm a rather emotional human being, so I'm in this traps of trying to figure out what the heck's going on all the time, and more than half the time, not in the probably the right way, but at least they notice it. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely feel that too, like getting kind of tugged around by my emotions, or um, I think it's related, but also like my sensations. Like I'll feel tension or pain in like my stomach or my body, and then I'll start getting anxious about that, and it's like a almost like a self-winding thing where it's like, oh, is this, am I anxious because something was wrong, or is something hurting because I'm anxious? And then you start trying to figure out all these different diets or things, and it's just like, I think the best thing is just relax.
Yeah, Tara Brach has a phrase that's not coming to mind about that, but how we get into I think she calls it something like emotional looping, that we notice something about our experience, whether that's a mental part of the emotion or a physical part of it, and then we tell part of the story about it, or we worry about it, and then that loops around and becomes a spiral for many people. I think many people experience that. One of the things I've noticed is it's I find this view of recognizing that our emotions have both wisdom and confusion in them to be useful. But that doesn't tell you how to find the wisdom. Just knowing that, you can find it yourself. You usually need to give it enough space. You need to sit with it, perhaps in meditation, and work towards allowing it, the wisdom, to separate out, kind of like traditional images, scooping a glass of muddy water out of a lake, and if you want to clear it, you don't shake it harder. You have to leave it alone, and over time it settles. And so I think that for uh, one practice is just sitting with your emotions, and that can help. But there's another viewpoint that I'd like to talk about today that I think can help specifically with anxiety. Um, and this again is based on Robert Curzon, although I've adapted it a little bit. And the first thing to notice is that we often are not very discriminating when it comes to anxiety. We treat all sorts of different anxieties very similarly, when they're not truly similar at all. So I'm going to break it down into 4 types of anxiety. This is based on Robert Curzon's 3 types, but I think there are 2 subtypes of one of them. These are natural anxiety, 2 types of confused anxiety, and what he calls sacred anxiety. So natural anxiety is what the mind and body are really well built for. A snake rattles in front of you and you freeze and then back away. You're driving and you see another car is driving erratically and might hit you, and you react quickly, proportionately, and correctly. And so natural anxiety is this very present moment responding to real dangers happening right now. It tends to be specific, realistic, and usually brief. It's also usually helpful, is another characteristic of it. It usually helps you get through a situation. And the amount of anxiety you feel is often in direct proportion to the degree of danger you're in. So you could imagine if you're walking down a threatening street at night, it's dark, you don't know this street, and so you're on heightened alert, right? You hold some anxiety, which helps you. Again, the wisdom of anxiety is, pay close attention. Keep an eye out, and so you do that. That anxiety is useful in that situation. You could consider the amount of anxiety you'd feel if someone then steps out and robs you at gunpoint. The amount of anxiety you're feeling is going to be very different. But in both cases, once the robbery's over, or once you leave that street and you go someplace that you feel safe in again, you let go of the anxiety, or you can let go of the anxiety. You don't always let go of it. And so that brings us to our second type of anxiety, confused anxiety. And I think there are two types of confused anxiety, toxic anxiety and incorrect anxiety. For both of them, they're confused because the focus isn't on what's really here, but are ideas about the future or the past. So toxic anxiety tends to have certain characteristics of blame or chronic worry, negative emotions, self-doubt, panic, hopelessness. Not necessarily you're feeling these all at the same time, but those more extreme versions tend to be the toxic type of anxiety. It's generally negative. It often runs in families that your family of origin, if you had someone who's always complaining and worried, and often the children in that family grow up to have very similar things. Even if it isn't related to your family of origin, it seems to be pretty addictive. That once you get into the pattern of it, it gets hard to get out of that pattern. It's almost never helpful, in contrast to, say, natural anxiety. It's usually harmful. Now, this harm can take many different forms. It could be self-harm. My younger daughter often feels terrible self-doubt, and because of that, she then self-sabotages so that she continues to feel this way. It can show up in self-aggression. It can show up in addictions. It can show up in difficulties in relationships. But it tends to show up as a habitual way of reacting, not responding. And it's usually an overreaction. It might be to false alarms, that you become hypersensitive to things and react when there wasn't any real threat, or taking a real alarm or threat to an unreasonable and debilitating extent. And not only does it overreact to threats or perceived threats, it often misses opportunities. It sees them as threats. And so toxic anxiety often paralyzes us. Another characteristic is it's usually pretty vague. It doesn't, if you actually say, what is it you're afraid of right now about COVID-19? Most people in this country right now, and not only this country, are feeling some anxiety about it. But it's a vague threat. We're not quite sure what we're worried about a lot of the time, unless you've come into contact with it in some way and have seen what effect it has. Then you might be more specific. And so toxic anxiety often keeps us from growing because it does have these cycles. We stay stuck in these patterns. The third type of anxiety that's also, I would lump under this confused type, is incorrect anxiety. It's not as negative as toxic, but it's still reacting to what isn't here, such as, coronavirus. I'd say this is more of an incorrect, for some people rather than toxic. That all of you are safe at home, and we're interacting in a safe way. We could probably let go of the anxiety at this moment. We might need to pick it back up again when we go out the door, so that we make sure we, are keeping safe distance from people, or wearing masks, or are washing our hands enough. But when you're actually home safe, you could let go of it. And so if we're maintaining it when it's not a real threat at this moment, then I would call that an incorrect type of anxiety. Unfortunately, the news tries to keep us in this state. I think it is on purpose, or at least partly on purpose. I've noticed that there seems to be kind of an addiction cycle with the news, that the news tells you everything is horrible, and you should be worried. And then it tells you what the solution is. And the solution is to watch more news. Because being informed keeps you safe. So you watch more, and it makes you more anxious. And it tells you then, so keep watching more. It's really a clever type of addiction spiral, I think. So I think a lot of natural anxiety becomes incorrect anxiety when we carry it with us into times that it's not going to help us. And I think it's often based on the incorrect belief that thinking about it or worrying about it is somehow going to give us control over the situation. And the fourth type of anxiety is sacred anxiety. Sometimes we come into contact with something that pulls the rug out from under us. Death, divorce, sickness. I think COVID, again, could fit this, so that if you've lost your job or have to be working in a totally new way, or, clearly the world is not the way we expected it to be. And these are ripe times. When you have that sense of discomfort and uncertainty, that's not an anxiety to be gotten away from. These situations help us to question who we thought we were, how certain we were about what we thought we were doing. This type of anxiety, if we work with it, it can bring us deep peace. It's an existential anxiety. Who am I? What's my purpose? What's the meaning of my life? What is my direction? I will die. I don't know when. What do I want to accomplish before then? What do I want to leave behind? These questions are sacred questions. These are the types of anxiety-producing questions that underlie the spiritual path. They encourage self-reflection. They encourage us to let go of control, ultimately. So, a great deal of the Buddhist project is learning discernment, and that's what we need here. When we're anxious, we don't want to just act out or push it away or seek to distract yourself. Instead, the first step perhaps is figure out what kind of anxiety it is. It may not only be one, of course, it may shift over time. I think for many people, toxic anxiety is the easiest to recognize because it's often a pattern. So a question to help you recognize it is, have I felt this before? This is Pema Chodron's question. Have I felt this before? Do I know what I'm going to do even before I do it because I'm in this pattern? Incorrect anxiety, perhaps a question to help recognize that is, am I worried about getting what I want? Natural anxiety often resolves itself, although sometimes it's not clear what to do. So can you allow yourself to not know without moving it to incorrect anxiety, which would be trying to plan and strategize? Those are strategies, that's the incorrect anxiety when we're trying to control the future by planning it out and strategizing about it. And sacred anxiety, you have to respect it. You have to respect yourself. You have to give it space. It's not going to resolve into a nice, easy answer. But it can be asked, in many of those questions I already mentioned, what is my direction? What do I care most about? What do I want to be working toward? So a mantra that you can use, I'm going to call it a mantra because I know Jay hates the word koan. So a mantra that could be used to help keep us focused on the benefits of natural and sacred anxiety and away from incorrect or toxic anxiety is just 4 words. Yes. And now what? Yes. And now what? The yes is important because first we have to allow what is. We spend our time fighting what is, thinking about past and future, strategizing, planning, wishing it were different than the way it is, complaining about how it is. All that is wasted energy. It is how it is. So start with yes. Things are the way they are at this moment. That's not the same as accepting. We're not saying you have to think it's okay, but you have to at least stop fighting what really is. The situation is how it is right now. And once we've done that, now we can work with what is. And that's where the second part of this mantra comes in. And now what? Okay, so things are how they are. Now what can I do in this moment? Maybe the answer is nothing. Maybe it's not clear yet. In both of these cases, then now what is stop worrying, but wait and keep paying attention. Maybe the answer will be clear, in which case, do it. And then ask, yes, and now what again in a few moments, because once you've done it, the situation has changed. Often we'll find that we just need to give the moment some space, and this can allow the wisdom to separate from the confusion. This makes it a little easier to notice what type of anxiety it is that we're working with, and then respond appropriately rather than just react to it or try to get away from it. So I'd like us to do another meditation to contemplate this. So go ahead and take a meditative seat. And we'll start as before, checking in with the body, finding a place that feels grounded and connected, and yet rising up out of that grounded connectedness. And checking in with the mind, noticing its quality right now. Is it jumpy monkey mind? Is it intrigued and curious? Is it calm and relaxed? We're not trying to force it to be one of these. We're just noticing what is. And we'll start with a couple of minutes of settling into our breath. And then I'll guide meditation on these 4 types of anxieties. So noticing where you feel the breath, placing your attention there. And you can either just try to hold your attention here, or if you'd like to return to the meditation we did earlier, where you're also bringing into awareness the weight, the gravity, the settledness, the connectedness of your body, and the simultaneous lightness, rising upness, alertness of your being. both at once, with the breath in the middle of it. If you've just been focusing on the breath, I invite you to take a moment to feel the connection you have to the earth, to your chair, to your seat. Being hugged by the earth, connected to all who are on the earth. Part of something great and unimaginable in its greatness. We are all connected in ways we can't understand. And we are all settled on the earth, even if we don't feel settled. And so from this place of settledness, I'm going to have us do a contemplative meditation where we use the power of our minds to understand and observe our minds. And for many people, it will help to close your eyes if they're open. And I'd like you to bring to mind something that makes you anxious. It might be a particular situation. It might be a thought of an argument you had or are going to have. It might be the state of politics right now. It might be worry for someone who's sick. And bring it to mind in enough detail that you start to feel the anxiety in your body. And people will feel it very differently. Some people feel it as a tightening in the chest or around the heart, or an unsettledness in the stomach, or their breath quickens, or their shoulders or neck tense. It often has a feeling of constriction for many people, but how you feel that constriction certainly varies from person to person. But bringing this anxiety-producing situation or memory to mind in enough detail that you feel some of that constriction. Now, I'd like you to look at it a little differently. The anxiety may have multiple parts. Some of it might have started as natural anxiety and moved into incorrect anxiety, where you were trying to do things to control the future. Maybe it never was natural. There was really nothing you came into contact with, but you've been telling yourself a story and getting angry and anxious about it. And so it's toxic anxiety. Maybe it's an unsettled feeling that you really don't know what to do with your life in this moment. And that's sacred anxiety. How can you be of benefit? What does this feeling of anxiety provoke in you? What type of anxiety is it, or types? It might be several of them at once. It might be it started as one and changed into another. Take a few moments and see if you can discern what is the wisdom of this anxiety. What are you trying to tell yourself that's important? Or what were you trying to? And once you solved it, it was done, in which case it was natural anxiety. And I'll be quiet for a while and let you work on this. And if it became easy, or if you solve it, bring up a different thing that makes you anxious, like going home for Thanksgiving, or what it feels like when you know you've been wrong. And so if you figure one out, or even if you don't want to stay with that one, that's okay. You don't have to stay with the same one for this whole time. You can try a couple different things that you've been anxious about. We're not trying to change the anxiety as much as discern. What type of anxiety is it? What wisdom does it have to tell me? How do I act out of the confusion side? And how can I recognize the confusion a little better so I do less acting from the confusion and more from the wisdom? if you get distracted, see if you can tell whether that distraction was a true distraction, such as a distracting thought coming in, or noticing a sound, or whether it was a reaction to the anxiety that you're trying to feel. Was it a trying to get away from this exercise? And if it was, don't attack yourself for it. Notice that's very typical. Notice that maybe that's part of your habit. We're trying to not be so pulled around and buffeted by our anxiety. So we need to see what our habits are with it clearly. And if trying to get away from it is one of them, that's okay. Then you're seeing more clearly. And we'll continue for about 2 more minutes. And releasing the contemplation. Taking 3 deep breaths. Recognizing the connectedness you have, the upliftedness you have. Those didn't leave you, even if your experience was you stopped feeling them, you stopped noticing them, you started being anxious. Even underneath that anxiety, you were still connected and uplifted. And releasing any tension that may have come in that's still with you. Checking in again with your mind, noticing its quality right now. How does it feel? Is it different than it's been before? If so, how? Is it the same? If so, how? That's always an interesting question. How is something the same? Well, thank you for joining me in that. With that, I'd be interested, what was your experience during that meditation? Was it easy? Was it difficult? What did you discover as you tried to dig into it? So feel free to unmute yourself uh, and share whatever you'd like. Matt, you
Okay,
look
I'll go.
okay. Go ahead. Go. Please
That's
do.
me. So one of the things that you had said was, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but I'm close.
I
Is
didn't either.
basically, but I'll listen to it later. Is basically to pause and and look at what could be done. A thing that's been very helpful for me is looking at what can be done, but also at a way to be.
Can you say more about that?
So sometimes it's more important that I bring to the moment a beingness, a quality. We'll call it a quality. Bring a quality to, rather than some kind of what we Westerners would call doing.
Mm-hmm.
What to say, what to do, what to think, whatever. But it to kind of flip it a little bit and say, okay, what kind of quality would be appropriate in this moment? And then the quality usually will show up.
Yeah. No, I think that makes perfect sense. It's better than I said it. In that, and now what may not be a thing to do, but it may be, I need to be paying attention and be attentive, or be open, or be curious, or be worried. Is that kind of what you mean by quality, Jay? You muted yourself again.
Yeah, I did. So quality may be this moment, compassion is this moment, loving kindness. Those are the easy ones because everybody uses that. Everybody uses love too, so we'll throw love out there. It's another word, though. It's another 4-letter word to me, just like Cohen. But sometimes there's a shift that occurs when a quality is introduced. It's almost like seasoning, when I'm cooking and putting in a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It changes the whole taste of the experience.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I'll try. One thing I've noticed was that when I got deep enough to the situation, it makes me anxious. I opened my eyes and I was out. I stopped it. I distracted myself because I didn't want to think about it anymore. It was very unpleasant. And then you mentioned that a few minutes later. And but then it was helpful because I came back to it and I kept thinking about it. And I'll give you an example. For me, as part of my job is going to other universities and presenting my work, and I feel extremely anxious about those. So I tried to think about what is it that I feel anxious about, because I've done them and I know that once I've done them, they go pretty well. Turns out I'm not anxious about presentations. I'm anxious about the paper not being good enough or not being ready in time for presentation because they are planned so far in advance. Then I thought more about it and I found out that the most frequent situation was where I didn't choose the presentation. The committee decided for me to send me on an exchange at the time when I just happened to be with no new work. And I eventually gave out the presentation to a colleague and then it all got canceled because of COVID. But I realized that, okay, so maybe the solution to that is that there is control that I can take, which is to please don't send me to stuff that I didn't sign up for. You know, as if I'm invited, I'll deal with that. And if I apply to conference, I did make the decision. So I have a paper to send. And so it was very, very good exercise because I really truly had no idea what was making me so anxious about that particular presentation. Even now, you know, weeks after it's been canceled, and I know now. So that was helpful. Another example that because I went through several of them, was that I used to go grocery shopping in this environment right now and feel very stressed out doing that. And what I found out was that I had expectations on how people should behave, how they should social distance or wear masks or whatever it may be. And of course that doesn't happen. And in the moment that I accepted that I'll just go and whatever happens, happens, I felt much better about these trips. I used to come back from grocery shopping these days absolutely exhausted and mentally drained because nobody was doing what I think they should be doing. And then I realized I don't think they should be doing what I think they should be doing. And it's absolutely fine because it's really just our wishful thinking of remaining in control, including the recommendations truly. While it's good to follow them, it's not like they're gonna solve everything. So that was my experience.
Thank you.
It was rather painful, by the way. You always bring these exercises that just cut me out. I'm trying not to feel mean towards you.
One of my teachers says the true Dharma should always make us feel uncomfortable.
Oh.
So I take it as a compliment.
Can you hear me, Doug?
Yes.
I have a question about the fourth type of anxiety, the sacred one.
Mm-hmm.
And in the one sentence or two sentence, what's the description of the sacred anxiety?
Existential anxiety.
Sacred equals existential?
I think it's broader than existential, but I think we often.
I all of a sudden can't hear you.
Oh, you don't hear me? Do others hear me?
Yeah.
Wait.
Okay.
Oh, now I do. Go ahead.
Sacred's broader than existential, but I think existential anxiety is one form of it. That when the rug feels somewhat pulled out from under us, that's often a clue for sacred anxiety. I think that, you know, we thought we knew what everything was like, and all of a sudden we're confronted with realizing it's not. And those could be things about ourselves or things about our situation or things about other people, but it brings us into a closer awareness of the gap. I'm going to use a somewhat overused Buddhist word, that we see the spaciousness, we see the possibility, we are unsure what to do, and we experience that often as a type of anxiety, whereas it is anxiety. I'm not saying it's not anxiety, but it is not an anxiety to be gotten away from. It's an anxiety to bring closer to us because it's trying to help us see what's really important, what it is that we really deeply care about. what our direction is, so does that help explain it better,
Yeah.
Kathy?
Yeah, I took notes and I said what you said, but I just wanted to make sure there wasn't a couple more nuggets that I didn't hear.
Yeah.
And then my second question is the mantra.
I can get you a link for a place where he talks a little bit more about sacred anxiety, if you'd like.
Oh, that'd be great. Sure.
All right, I'm going to go away from camera, but I'm still hearing you. So go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, on the mantra, if you would just give an example, and anybody here in this session, give an example, like you would say, yes, here's my phenomenon of anxiety. Yes, here it is. Is this how we apply it? Because we're saying yes. And then the second part is, and now what? And is the now what saying, this is the flavor, to take Jane's words and yours also, this is the shift, or the way I want the picture to go. So yes, here's the phenomenon of the anxiety. I'm owning it. I see it. I'm just wondering if I'm understanding the mantra correctly. And then the second part is, but here's how I want to spin it. Here's how I want it to be in my life.
I'll quickly answer, but I think others will have different ways of answering it that might be useful. So I'd like to hear other people's thoughts on this. So we'll take the the coronavirus crisis as an example. I notice it's making me anxious. So okay, part of that anxiety sometimes is, boy, I wish it weren't like this, right? I wish I could go do my work like normal. I wish I could go hang out with my friends like normal. So the yes is saying, well, things really are like this. So all that wishing about how it isn't helping me. And so now what can I do? Well, if I'm feeling disconnected from my friends, I could try to get a Zoom meeting with them, which in fact we did with a bunch of our families recently. Or it may be there's nothing I can do at this moment. So I should go do the dishes. That's what I need to do now. Or it's I just need to let go of that feeling and bring in a quality of acceptance or something like that. We've had some difficult situations with our younger daughter, and we can sit there and fight with her about it or tell her that she shouldn't act in this way or whatever, but that's that hasn't been working. So all right, she's having these difficulties. Yes. Now what can we do? What would actually be helpful? And that answer has changed over time as the situation changes. So it's just trying to bring us back. It's not so much about I see it as less about trying to figure it out and more about trying to bring me back to what am I doing right now? Or what can I do right now? Right now, the thing I can do about coronavirus is stay home. That's a thing I can do. And that's enough. Do other people want to answer what they thought about how they could work with this mantra?
I think I have a similar approach. Just a moment ago when we were having this meditation, I thought, I have a brother, my only brother lives in St. Louis, and we haven't seen each other since January. And sometimes that horrible thought comes into my mind of, well, he could die. And so I thought, yes, but the what now thing is, but he's not. And therefore thinking that he could die is just giving me very unnecessary pain. it's just acknowledging that, yes, that thought exists. Yes, that's scary, but there's absolutely nothing I need to do now because he's alive and fine. And statistically, will continue to be that way.
So one thing for me is I found it's much easier to live in an and world than it was to live in an or world. So let me try to explain that. So an and world says in that and world is much more inclusive, and it brings things in, and respects the thing. It respects things. The or world was, it had to be one way or the other, and it was a very hard. And so and there was a lot of swinging, a lot of swinging in that. A lot of swinging. And that swinging really tires me out. So for me, it's just been living in an and world has been a much easier way to live. And then there's been a lot of byproducts of living in that and world. So that's how I take what Douglas said. And that's how I've taken what Douglas has said in the past.
Oh, that's phenomenal. Thank you so much. That and versus or is beautiful. And I see myself be that strong sometimes, but then I see myself be the weakling and do the or thing. And so thanks for sharing that. I think that's a powerful philosophy.
Yeah, that's what's at the heart of a lot of the somewhat enigmatic Zen types of sayings about not having opinions or giving up all judgment, giving up all discrimination. They don't actually mean that you stop knowing what things are or that you stop even having opinions. It's that you stop thinking stop making or start making yes and.
That's awesome. Love it.
I feel a lot of this practice boils down to it's like stripping the unnecessary sets of thoughts and opinions. I am able to go much faster from situation to what it means, kind of like eliminating the lies that you want to make for yourself in presented this way or that. It becomes much more brutal and honest, and there's not as many variations. And the hard part is accepting that, yeah, you're just making a story to spin it the other way. There's really not that many ways. And going to that point quicker and accepting it, that's kind of what I'm getting a lot from these meditative practices. It's sometimes scary how quickly it happens and how crystal clear it is. But at the same time, how not pleasant, because that's not the answer that I was looking for. It's not the droids I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think you're exactly right. This practice is all about removing what's not necessary. It isn't about finding some extra elevated state. It's about coming back to the ground of our being, and that becomes elevated because we stop separating ourselves from it, and it becomes much less anxiety producing because we're working with what is. So I think you're exactly right that this is all about stripping away all the layers. It's not necessarily. It's not so that we don't ever do it again. It's so we can tell the difference. My teacher, whom some of you have met, and some of you have heard how, even though he appears very kind and gracious when he's in front of the group, works with some of his students, me in particular, in a much harsher and a lot of swearing way. And he said, and he has very strong opinions. And he says in almost, contiguous breaths, this really opinionated thing. And then he says, and that's all bullshit. This is just an opinion. And then he goes back and says it again, because it really is his opinion. And it's, crap. And it's meaningless. And yet it's still really his opinion. And it's that ability to know that our opinion isn't the truth. It's just our belief about something, our opinion, something we're layering onto it, which doesn't mean you don't have it. It's not about getting rid of our opinions. It's not about getting rid of thinking. It's about not being fooled by them.
Not being what?
Fooled by them.
Fooled, yes.
Not tricking ourselves.
Uh-huh.
I think something that I struggle with constantly is not learning how to have the wisdom to know when you're not allowing your opinion to trick you, right? And I feel like sometimes it still feels like my opinion is the truth, and I don't know how to separate that. So I feel like when we were doing the activity, I was trying to understand my anxiety and trying to figure out, what type of anxiety is, but I feel like my opinion still feels like it's the truth.
Sure. That's okay. This is not a practice that is done in a day. So I think that, it's going to sound trite, but I still believe it to be honest. The first step is recognizing that when we have our opinions, they feel true because we're the one who thought them. We're the one who's feeling. And anything that you figured out or you think or feel you believe is right. And that's the way human minds work. The problem is the world is divided into people who think they're right. So how do we work with that? Well, there's not one approach, and the same approach doesn't work equally well or equally quickly for everyone, but meditation certainly is one that you can sit and watch thoughts arise and notice how the feeling that all thoughts tend to have a feeling that goes with them. And then that feeling often pushes the next thought, which pushes the next feeling. And so that there's this cycle, and that cycle feels true because it is our feeling. And in a sense, it is true. That really is your thought. That is your feeling. So we can use contemplative. So one is to watch these cycles in your mind. Another approach is to do a contemplative meditation where take one of the things that you believe to be true. You believe with your whole heart to be true. You have a coworker who's a jerk. All right. And you can list all the ways in which this coworker has been a jerk to you. Now, does his mother think he's a jerk? Does his partner think he's a jerk? Does his child think he's a jerk? Is he a jerk in all situations? Is he a jerk? Starting to recognize that our viewpoint, while true for us, is one pretty narrow little viewpoint.
That's good.
And so doing that type of contemplative, take any of your deeply held beliefs and try to think how other people would see it. Try to understand why the situation became the way it is. And recognizing that if you had the same upbringing, the same training, the same experiences, you would be the same way. You would believe the same things that other person who believes the exact opposite of you. If you had been brought up like them, you'd think like them. You'd feel like them. So these are not ways of trying to tell us are we're wrong. There are ways of trying to loosen it up so that we don't just believe it as capital T truth, but start seeing it as very small t truth. It's my opinion, which I know is just my opinion and therefore not real. And yet it's still my opinion. And so we're trying to just loosen up our grip on it. Another way sometimes is to try to have a sense of humor about it, to recognize how absurd some of our opinions are. And so a kind of game that Jennifer and I play is, since I am a university professor and highly educated and have a pretty high opinion of my opinions, I routinely take it to an extreme and tell her that everything I think is right, and she doesn't get to have any opinions unless I give them to her.
Whoa.
And so you have to have a relationship that can tolerate that type of playfulness, but that playfulness helps me, burst my own bubble a little bit and recognize that, okay, I'm being silly here sometimes with my own opinions. So there might be some of these techniques you can try with, and try either in interactions with people or by yourself on the meditation cushion. But it's a long process. I still believe most of my thoughts, and I've been doing this practice for 30 years. So, so I may not be the best student to try to learn from. Maybe there are other people who can tell you how to do it quicker.
And I think those are great. And it's just, I feel like when it applies to other, like when you're thinking about the situations in relation to another person, I think it becomes something that I can feel, I can apply, but it becomes more difficult when you're thinking about those thoughts or beliefs that you have about yourself and how to separate that, right? When you believe something about yourself, and how do you know that's true or not? Or how do you separate that wisdom from that confusion?
Right. I think you're right that that's just generally harder. I think it's especially hard for women in this society, who've been told you're supposed to be hypercritical of yourselves and not accept compliments and not, and that, and then we see this erupt in horrible problems like anorexia or things like that, where the person can't believe the scale, can't believe, they just have this belief about themselves that's distorted, that then causes a great deal of harm. So I think this culture makes it extra hard, especially for women. So how do you work with that? Well, the Buddha talked about several steps in the Kalama Sutta that you should look at it for yourself. That it is important to do the self criticism. Is this true? Is this true? Does it lead? Does having this belief lead to suffering or harm, and harm, or does it lead to beneficial actions? And so that's one way to tell. Usually, if it's a sacred anxiety, doing it's going to lead to more benefit for you. If it's natural anxiety, doing it's going to lead to more benefit. If it's one of the confused anxieties, it's often going to lead to more problems. So that can help you maybe be more critical of whether you should believe this belief about yourself. But he goes on further to say that, is this something that people who are wise or learned agree with? And so when it's a belief about yourself, it's hard to know who's wise about, who knows you. But there are people who know you and people that you trust. And so you can ask your parents, your partners, your best friends, and get their viewpoint. And then check, does our view line up with their view? And if it does, then probably it is a belief worth continuing to have about yourself. But if it doesn't, then, use that discomfort of the discrepancy as a way, work with that discomfort. Why don't you want to believe them? And sometimes you'll find that answer leads to fear. Sometimes you'll find that answer leads to some experience you had that you're still carrying with you. But we often get uncomfortable when we hear something about ourselves that doesn't fit our view. And so don't dismiss that discomfort. The discomfort is the wisdom arising again.
That's a very good way to put it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Doug, may I add that sometimes when you can't figure things out on your own, and you can't trust your own thoughts about yourself or your family, because family could be, how do you put it, out of the best intentions, saying not the things you want to hear. And sometimes going to a professional, to therapy, can help. And I've experienced that firsthand after just a few sessions, where this completely independent person told me their opinion of me, and it kind of matched what I was suspecting, but it was very liberating at the same time. And it really boiled down to what you are, and don't expect to change others though. So you and there are them, and that's it. So I can't of course recreate the entire thing, but it was extremely helpful, because at that point, for some reason, I believed that I can really accept myself as I am and not try to pretend to be something else. For example, I'll never be the cool, composed persona, no matter how much I try. And so some inherent awkwardness and goofiness is just going to be with me forever, and that's okay. So it helps if somebody independent says that, with credentials too.
No, I agree. I think that's exactly, that would fall under the, Buddha's, guidance of seek a sage, right? There's someone who knows something but is independent of the situation. Sure. Any other thoughts, questions?
I want to thank you for being so generous.
Oh, it's
Thank
my
you,
pleasure.
Doug. Thank you for sharing this time with us.
And I'll be back again in 2 weeks, and we'll kind of pick up from this and do a little bit more in the, what are some practices that you can use to work with the anxiety. So I hope everyone has a lovely weekend. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.